welcome to the Institute of World Politics, and welcome to all of you who are joining us as well online. I'm Patricia Schluter, founder of the IWP Global Impact Discussion Series. I'm delighted to see so many friends, new friends also, to IWP. For those of you who are new to the Institute, we are an independent graduate school of national security and international affairs. We offer 5 master's degree programs and 18 certificate of graduate programs, as well as executive masters. As you may know, IWP's mission is dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of international realities and the ethical conduct of statecraft based on knowledge and values, common goals IWP and Brookings share in common. It's not just an honor for me, but also for IWP to welcome Tom Wright today. I'll appreciate if all of you turn your phone off, unless you're on Twitter, and the hashtag for the discussion, since we're on the record, will be geopolitics. So Tom Wright is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe, and a fellow in the project on international order and strategy at the Brookings Institution. And let me give you a moment to present the purpose of the project at Brookings is to understand the changing power dynamics in the international system and the implications for your strategy and international cooperation. Tom is also a non-resident fellow at the Laurie Institute for International Policy. Previously, he was executive director of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and senior researcher for the Princeton Project on National Security. Wright works on U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy, Donald Trump's worldview, the future of Europe and Asian security. He also he has a doctorate from Georgetown University, a Master of Philosophy from Cambridge University, and a bachelor's and master's from University College Dublin. He has also had a pre-doctoral fellowship at Harvard University's Buffer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University. Writings have appeared in the American Political Science Review, Orbis, Survival, the Washington Quarterly, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, and the Washington Post, as well as a number of international newspapers and media outlets. So extremely fortunate to welcome Tom today. Tom Wright is the author of All Measures Short of War, The Context for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, also available for sale at the entrance. He assesses why it is that a number of commentators are arguing that the liberal international order appears to be unraveling, and if indeed it is, what strategic choices face the United States and its allies. But I won't give you the answer, Tom will. Crucially, Tom will ask how the liberal order can adapt and thrive in this new age. He will propose a new American strategy called responsible competition, directed towards bolstering the liberal international order and maintaining Western's influence going forward. So let me start by this. So, as you know, there's a lot of events in the world. Being in Washington, D.C., we're pretty much served with lots of think tanks and discussions, and it's occupying a lot of attention. Sometimes, usually when you give talks on international order or U.S. leadership, these kinds of issues, you need to start off by explaining why we should care about this question. And I think President Trump has taken care of this week. And it's a tough week to be an optimist with everything happening in the world. And it reminds me of an old Russian joke, which I'm sure you know, about the difference between a pessimist and an optimist. And the pessimist is somebody who looks at the world and sees that everything is dark and says, it can't possibly get any worse. And the optimist says, oh yes, it can. So Tom's book explains why great power rivalry has the U.S. return, how to think about it, and how can we respond to it. And his book has driven significant debate and received some fantastic reviews in the media and have a great impact on how we think international order today. So if you're looking for a great summer book, well, this is it. So I'll ask you a question first, and then I'll go further on the notion of international order. So Tom, I'll ask you, why this book? Because you say not an international order that falls apart. So what's next? Because initially you were expecting Hillary Clinton to become president, and you furiously rewrote some parts of it. So what changed?
Firstly, Patricia, thank you so much for the invitation and to the Institute for World Politics. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming on such a hot summer's day. I think it's interesting. I started to write this book, I guess, a couple of years ago, but I've been thinking about it for some time beforehand, because when I did my graduate studies, I worked on sort of issues of international order, and in the 2000s there was this assumption sort of underpinning much of the conversation about the future of the international order, which was that we were all sort of headed on the same sort of pathway toward liberal international order, right? That we had this sort of notion of convergence, that over time all countries, the BRICS, many other countries would all become responsible stakeholders in the international order, because essentially we all share the same challenges. We have the same problems: terrorism, nuclear proliferation, economic volatility, and it was believed that these issues were much more important than the old-style geopolitical issues that divided us. So no one really talked that much about territorial disputes, and there were crises and problems. The Iraq War in 2003 was incredibly divisive, but it was largely confined to the Middle East. The countries that objected at the UN Security Council. No one really worried that the US is going to invade Iraq and then invade France or anywhere else, and Russians and Chinese and others didn't send troops to Iraq. They didn't arm Saddam Hussein, and so all of these crises were sort of contained. And I remember thinking in sort of the late, around 2006, 2007, that this sort of notion of and particularly when Obama took over, and we had and just after the financial crisis, that assumption of sort of responsible stakeholderism or convergence, that there were real limits to it. Because all of a sudden China began to push back, and Putin gave his speech in Munich in 2007, and there was a little sort of, embers of geopolitical competition re-emerging, and I think those really gathered pace in 2010, 2011, but they were still quite limited. And so I was interested for a while in what strategic competition looks like in the 21st century, and how that's sort of constrained or shaped by globalization. And then as sort of the years went on, and as Putin returned to power in Russia, and Xi Jinping came to power in China, and the financial crisis, like that stagnation sort of continued, I think we saw the very rapid unraveling of that idea of convergence. And instead of convergence, we had significant divergence, and we had Russia and China beginning to, for the first time really since the Cold War, to balance against the United States. One of the defining features of this post-Cold War period was the absence of balancing. Political scientists wrote many books about it. That balancing has sort of returned. So we saw them sort of push for a sphere of influence. We saw the hopes of convergence in the Middle East sort of fall apart really after the failure of the Arab awakening. There was no real prospect of positive reform there, either under the Obama sort of vision or under the George W. Bush vision. And the globalization, of course, became this incredibly controversial dynamic after the financial crisis. So that's sort of really what led me to write the book, and I was sort of glad I didn't write it earlier, actually, because I think the developments continued sort of apace. And so it's really about what this new era of strategic competition will look like in a world that's still interconnected, still interdependent, still globalized. This is not going to be a return to the 19th century. It's going to be something quite different. And so I try to look at what that competition is like. And just one final word before we talk in more detail, I guess, about different parts in terms of Trump. I didn't think Trump would win, and I thought, but after the book was essentially finished before the election, and then after the election they said, you can go back and re-look. But actually I didn't have to rewrite that much of it, because what I sort of began to realize was that the book is essentially about why the world and how the world's becoming more nationalistic and geopolitically competitive. And I thought, sort of in the latter part of the book, that the US would probably be pushing back against that. I didn't realize that it would actually be enveloped in it to a greater extent than I had thought. So actually, in some ways, the argument of the book, I just should have taken it a bit further. And so most of the, 95% of it, I think, still very much held up. I did address it in the introduction and in the conclusion about what it means, because I do think that Trump personally, I started to write about Trump's foreign policy about 18 months ago, and I thought from the beginning that he does have quite a radical critique. He is sort of an opponent of the international order, has been for 30 years, but he is somewhat constrained, I think, by his cabinet and by the establishment and by institutions and how he goes about that. So I think one of the interesting things, and we can talk about it, is the extent to which he will be able to sort of, further erode the international order, or if he will be constrained by it. But I think either way, the big sort of development, the big change, that the US will not be a champion of sort of upholding the liberal international order as long as he is president.
So to lead further to what you said, in all those crises and all those successes, the United States has played a pivotal role. And your book talks about the need for the US to play a leadership role in the international system. So is that still true? Is there still a space for the US to lead? And what can it do to build restraint into the international system?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic actually about the US. I mean, I think the United States is not a declining power at all, and I think the US in some ways is even a rising power. In some other areas it may be relatively in decline vis-a-vis China, but overall it's very competitive. And I think we sort of overstate sometimes, just by looking at some very crude metrics of GDP growth or other things, we sort of massively overstate sort of the US relative decline even. I mean, if you look around the world, there's an argument that the US is in relative decline in some areas vis-a-vis China, but it's certainly not vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, it's been increasing vis-a-vis Russia. That doesn't seem to have helped things very much, because Russia has still been very troublesome, and its growth has actually been stronger than many European countries. So I'm very optimistic about the United States, and I think the US has sort of a choice of strategies available to it. So it can choose to lead or not to lead. That's really, up to that's up to the president. That's up to people at the ballot box to decide what option they want. So there are some people out there who think that the United States can't lead because it's physically not possible. I think that the US can, but I think it has some challenges, and one of them is that we're sort of stuck in this mindset of convergence, where the US strategy is sort of organized around the idea that there isn't a significant geopolitical competition. I think Obama really understated the degree of geopolitical competition between the major powers, and so I think the main sort of challenge is to understand what leading in a more geopolitically competitive world looks like what strategy you want to sort of adopt. And so in the book I go between a couple of different strategies. The one I favor is one I call responsible competition, which is to sort of recognize that the world is more competitive, and that the primary challenge, the big new thing really is the old thing, is the return of geopolitics, but it's how to do that on a regional basis, because I think that will unfold really regionally, and how to do so recognizing, and this is where the title of the book comes in, that the competition will not be leading up to a major conflict. I think major conflict is unlikely. It could happen inadvertently, but I think all countries are sort of competing with all measures short of war, with all of the different things below the threshold of major conflict. And so understanding how to, wage that competition and succeed in that competition beneath that threshold of major conflict, I think is the primary challenge. So I try to get into detail on that. And then the other thing I do is sort of look at strategies of restraint, strategies of doing less, of pulling back. And I think, although they're very different, there's some similarities there between Presidents Obama and Trump, both of whom I think, wanted to do a bit less. I mean, Obama in a very, very different way, and he was a liberal internationalist, but I think he did want to see some retrenchment, and in some ways, Trump, took that to extremes in different ways and in a much more nationalistic direction. But I try to look at those strategies in detail too, and to show how your choice of strategy isn't just about details. It's really also about the type of world you want to create. And to me, there are really two options available. One is some version of what we've had before of the liberal international order, and the other is a much more mercantilist, nationalistic spheres of influence system where China's preeminent in East Asia, sharing power with the US, and Russia is much more powerful in Eastern Europe.
So let me circle back to what you said towards the beginning on force projection, because towards what you said at the end, you echo Larry Summers' article on the FT in the editorial, which I strongly recommend reading, where he outlines, which is a pessimistic view of what happened during the G20 summit, and he portrays a very worrying picture. But one of the critical and under-discussed facets of U.S. leadership is, as you said, force projection. It's protection, the U.S. protecting international shipping lanes, for example, which nobody really discusses. The U.S. plays a critical balancing military role in the world. So is there a substantial risk of the U.S. pulling back from that role? And what can the U.S. do, if anything, to try and invest in that role in others, where others will find alliance to help share that burden?
Yeah, I think there are two categories of risk, right? I think there's a risk that's unique to Trump, and then there's a more general risk that would have happened whoever is president, right? If it was Hillary Clinton or Marco Rubio or whoever. And the risk with Trump is that he will decide that this stuff is not important to him, right? That he does not want to fulfill America's traditional commitments. He doesn't understand why the US is in Europe and won't push back if challenged there. Or maybe if he's offered a deal on North Korea, he'll sort of pull back in the South China Sea and not see its significance, or to be willing to trade it away for an economic deal with China. So that is sort of the risk with him. I think that risk has mitigated somewhat over the last 6 months, partly because his cabinet is very mainstream and they're very much pushing in the traditionalist direction, and he has tried to pull back in some ways from this, but he's been sort of persuaded not to. And so the recent kerfuffle over Article 5 in NATO, I think, was a good example, where he basically had to reverse himself. I mean, he tried to resist. He never endorsed it for sort of 4 or 5 months. He was asked to do so at Brussels, and he took it out of the speech, but then he did so at a press conference with the Romanian president, and then again recently, and I think it was under duress, but it was partly because he sort of realized that, the alternative was to run a high level of risk that his cabinet just thought was unacceptable. And in the South China Sea, after a period of really easing off freedom of navigation operations, they're sort of doing more, and they're sort of signaling that they will be present there. So I'm a little bit, relieved in terms of that, that he's not sort of undertaking a massive revolutionary change in those areas at the moment. Now, I've always thought with him that the risk is less in proactive attempts to revolutionize American foreign policy and more in what he may not do at a time of crisis. And so if he actually, face a crisis in Eastern Europe or in the South China Sea, would he do something that cost political capital, that required him to rally the people for, to uphold the international order, or would he not? And I think that jury is still out. But in general, I think the signs have been a little bit reassuring in recent months. But the second category of risk, which in many ways is more difficult, is the risk that, Clinton or Rubio or anyone else would have faced, which is that the US is actually under pressure in these key regions, particularly from revisionist powers. And in the South China Sea, I think we see it with China. China is not a revisionist power globally, but it is regionally, and it is looking, I think, to seek an enhanced sphere of influence. And what revisionist powers do, and have always done very successfully, is to basically go after things that the status quo power regards as not particularly important or vital, right? Things that are sort of on the periphery. And then they say, you don't care about that so much to jeopardize your entire relationship with us. Like, why would you run the risk of conflict over, some island like Woody Island, or, back in the 30s over, the Danzig corridor, or Sudetenland, or in the 19th century, the US actually said it to Britain in terms of Venezuela or other areas of contention. And so revisionist powers, they can be good or bad. It sort of depends on your perspective. I mean, the US has been a revisionist power in the past as well. But just from a purely strategic point of view, it puts a great pressure on the status quo power if a country engages in revisionist actions. Because the truth is that on a case-by-case basis, it's actually probably not worth the overall relationship. Right now, the problem is in the aggregate, it adds up to quite a lot, right? So one little island in the South China Sea is not very important, but dozens and dozens of them may be strategically significant. But each time, it's what Thomas Schelling called sort of a salami slicing strategy. So the U.S., I think, has a problem in the maritime area in East Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, also to some degree in the East China Sea, although the dynamics are a little bit different there, and then in Eastern Europe as well on land in terms of some of the Russian behavior. And I think that's a big strategic problem. That's something I talk in the book about how I would address it. I think that the key is not to engage in a tit-for-tat response to every provocation, but to look at the overall strategic objective of the rival power and to try to deny them their objective in the aggregate. So I think there are ways to do that. But overall, I think it is a problem, and I think maintaining that sort of, the space in the commons is really crucial to, particularly at sea in Asia, is crucial to maintaining a healthy regional order there. Because if China gains control of the South China Sea, it won't necessarily close those sea lanes immediately, but it does change, I think, the nature of the order there. It makes it more China-centric. It would, I think, weaken U.S. alliances in the medium to long term, and I think its spheres of influence system is overall much more unstable, actually, than the system that we have at the moment.
So let's dive deeper into the issue of the South China Sea, because there's two key regions, it seems to us: Asia, Southeast Asia, from Korea to the South China Sea problems, and China's increased assertiveness militarily and politically, and of course the Middle East, which is strife and chaos. But as you know, crises always intervene before presidents find time to create a coherent world order. So what are the consequences of a decline in the institutions of global order for these two regions, or what might you see happening?
For the Middle East and East Asia? Well, I think that there are, in the book I sort of argue that actually the two regions of utmost strategic importance are East Asia and Europe. And I think that I'm not trying to dodge the question about the Middle East, but I think that those, to me, those are the sort of critical regions and that have significant sort of problems. And the Middle East, as I see it, is actually a little bit different. It's not a prize to be won as such. I mean, I don't think there's this great game for sort of control of the Middle East. But I do think that the question is how to sort of manage this massive instability that's at the heart of the region, and whether or not sort of pulling back will exacerbate that risk of contagion and potentially destabilize Europe, maybe even in time sort of East Asia as well, and the interaction between these regions. And I think it would actually. I think sort of pulling back from the Middle East would have broader destabilizing effects. But I think that the dynamic in each is actually different. I think in East Asia, I do think it is actually largely about China. I mean, there's many things happening in East Asia. There's lots of things happening independently of China. But I think in terms of the geopolitical instability, what I worry about is China's actions to its east, like particularly in the maritime space. I think more broadly, China's actions to its west with the One Belt, One Road and its broader sort of institutional initiatives with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I'm actually more relaxed about those, because I think while we may disagree with them, I think they're more normal, they're more legitimate, they're things that can be responded to with positive proposals of our own. But it's really in the maritime space, I think, and in the more coercive diplomacy side of it in East Asia, that's destabilizing. So I'm not, I don't know if it's a decline of global global sort of institutions, I think it has an impact on global institutions and will change those. In the Middle East, I think it's mainly to do with the failure of the Arab awakening, which really sort of was the nail in the coffin in terms of that old order that was stable, not very liberal at all, but provided some stability for the region that, you know, leaders just consistently bought more time on by propping it up until it couldn't be propped up anymore.
So in the book, you trace a very nice chronological analysis on Russia and China vision of world order, and you give a quote by the Bush administration that expressed hope that China would be a responsible stakeholder in the international order. So what is Russia's vision of global order? Because I remember at the Brookings Institution launch for your book, Robert Kagan said, "Oh, Russia has been declining for the last 400 years, but they're still there." And so what do you see as Russia's vision of global order? And on the Chinese perspective, how would one measure success in that area?
How would they measure success in terms of the future of the international order? Yeah. So Russia, you know, it's impossible really to disaggregate, I guess, the Russian view from the Putin view, but I'll try a little bit. I mean, I think there's Medvedev and other Russian politicians, I think, had a problem with the Western order, and they saw it as, you know, a tool of American power, and they worried about NATO expansion. But they also, I think, were open to engagement. They believed that maybe Russia had a future with structural economic reform. They could conceive of sort of changes in Russian society that would, you know, result in modernization. And they were still nationalistic, but I think they had a more sort of complex, nuanced view of it. Famously, of course, Medvedev backed Obama on the intervention in Libya, much to Putin's annoyance. And Putin is, I think, fundamentally different, though. Like he has an ideological critique of the international order that runs very, very deep. Like he believes that it is a direct threat to Russia. He is paranoid, I think, about Western behavior, not so much in terms of NATO expansion with NATO troops being closer to the Russian border. I actually think that's a bit of a red herring. You know, NATO's military strength in Europe has declined massively over the course of the last 20 years. That's the whole argument about Europe not spending enough, right? So that has declined, but I think he does legitimately worry from his point of view about color revolutions, about unconventional political warfare. He sees the US as having started that. He sees his recent action having responded to it. And I think he wants to basically overturn that order, particularly in Europe. I mean, he would like to break NATO, and he would like to massively undermine or weaken the European Union. And he's going about it in a series of innovative measures. He wants to establish a Russian sphere of influence. He doesn't have much going for him in terms of the tools at his disposal, but he does have hard power. He does have the will to use that hard power. He does have the sort of diplomatic power, and he is using that to considerable effect, I think. And so the other thing that's sort of interesting about Putin is that he actually has very little stake in the global economic order. Like he doesn't, unlike China, we will come to in a second, he doesn't sort of see the global economic order as being vital to Russia's success. In fact, he believes that Russia's reliance on that order is a strategic vulnerability, and that Russia needs to de-link from globalization and become more autonomous. So right back to his his dissertation, he sort of wrote about that, sort of seeing strategic autonomy as a crucial part of Russian strategy. And so he, I think, is someone who, you know, sees a more traditional type of world order with the great powers, where Russia is one of the great powers, where Russia has a veto over anything significant really that happens in Europe, where, you know, things are organized around the UN Security Council, not because of international law, but because that gives Russia a veto over everything, and the US is sort of retreated. So I think that's, you know, that's a very different sort of vision of the world than we have today. China, I think, you know, has some similarities, but it is fundamentally different. You know, it's not a power in decline, it's rising. It has a lot of economic power, it has a stake in the global economy. And there, I think, the big sort of contradiction in China is that it is largely, I think, a responsible stakeholder-ish internationally in terms of the global order, but it is revisionist regionally, and it is seeking to develop this enhanced sphere of influence in East Asia. And the question is, which is more important? Is its global status quo orientation more important, or its regional revisionism? And I argue that actually the regional revisionism is more important because, and this is sort of a theme running through the book, that ultimately the global order rests on healthy regional orders, not on global institutions. Global institutions are important, but it is more significant what a major power does in its neighborhood on matters of territory and respect for its neighbors than it is about arguments over voting weights at the IMF or the World Bank. Like, those things are important, but they don't really define what countries want. And so I think that regional part is really where everything starts. And there I think its goals are actually fairly similar to Russia's, although it goes about it in very different ways. It's not using hard power, it's not invading others, but it is using civilian vessels to remake the control of the South China Sea and other measures of coercive diplomacy.
I'd like to dive more into the Middle East because you didn't go as much into the book, which is understandable. You covered a lot. But taking the example of what's happening in Syria. So there's no domestic pressure to do something about Syria. Supposing that Assad leaves tomorrow, then what do we do? What follows from the moral decision to depose him? Does democracy automatically succeed him? If not, since you mentioned that the regional is more important than the global institutions, so what is the governance structure that will not magnify the threat?
Yeah, no, it's if I had the answer to that question, I'd probably be talking to the president right now. And no, I think that to me, like, the question on the Middle East comes down to sort of two choices. Like, one choice is what Obama did, and is to say, look, the Middle East is a mess. We don't want to get dragged in more, so we have to identify specific interests and protect those. And he had a list of 4 or 5 things: security of Israel, counterterrorism, protection of energy, a few other things, with no use of chemical weapons, and so on. And he said those, the U.S. would play a constructive role in advancing other interests like a regional order, or the end to hostilities in Syria, but only if others played their part too, and only if it was at an acceptable cost, right? And this actually sounded, I think, very reasonable to a lot of people. The problem with it was that, by disavowing any responsibility for regional equilibrium, and by sort of assuming that equilibrium would emerge on its own, as he did in his various interviews with Jeff Goldberg in The Atlantic, that the situation got immeasurably worse. And the consequences of that narrowness of interests resulted in costs that were massively contagious. And so the refugee flows from Syria almost collapsed the European Union, which is not something that they talked about in the Obama administration when they initially made the decision to sort of limit US involvement. And so my view, which I sort of say in the book, is that ultimately that sort of level of disengagement and sort of disavowing of responsibility for regional equilibrium will be hugely catastrophic. Because if it's true that we're at the beginning of a 30 years war, shouldn't we be doing everything in our power to prevent that from becoming a 30 years war, rather than sitting back and saying, it's inevitable? And so I do think that there's a responsibility there to try to impose some regional order. Now, we are where we are, and it's very, very hard to do that, and, there are virtually no good options left. I think that what Trump has started to do on the Middle East, I think is quite flawed, but part of it is recognizing a consensus, really, from the non-Obama sort of foreign policy establishment on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, that the only play left is really to support Sunni Arab states and to push back against Iran. I think that there's something to that. The question is, what do you do once you started to do it, right? Do you do that in the initial phase and then negotiate with Iran from at a later point on a regional equilibrium from a position of strength, or do you sort of just keep going, right? There's a risk that Trump will keep going, I think, but my proposal will be, which is not unique to me, is to basically try to re-establish a balance of power in the region by pushing back against Iran, and then at a future point negotiate with them for some type of regional equilibrium that would involve respect for majority and minority rights within countries, and sort of to try to freeze the situation in terms of this regional Cold War that's raging for control of the domestic governance systems of contested states.
So I'll leave it to the Middle East to what you said, and if the audience wants to bring more questions on the Middle East. But I want to circle back on go back to the US and EU and the transatlantic relation, and ask you about, do competitive world powers, since we have a rising America First agenda, a dented EU, signify a retreat from international alliances, multilateral institutions, and democracy?
It's interesting what's happening in Europe. I mean, so I've been pessimistic about Europe for a while, really since about 2010. I mean, I think that Europe has been stuck in this lost decade, after the financial crisis. And what we've seen and what I describe in the book are these multiple crises that are layered on top of each other and a negative synergy between them. So with the Euro crisis and the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the refugee sort of Syria crisis and Brexit and now Trump, right? And so all of these sort of reinforce each other, and there's very little way out, because Europe as the European Union is sort of stuck in this halfway anti-Goldilocks position, where everything is sort of just about wrong. So there's enough integration to be vulnerable, but not enough to have sort of common protections on, say, the financial side or even on the control of border side. And it's almost impossible to unwind it because no one knows how to unwind it in a responsible way. And it's almost impossible to go forward because everyone disagrees about what that would look like. And so there are fundamentally different views in Germany and in France and in Eastern Europe, and these visions are sort of contested. And so, we're left where Europe is sort of muddling through, but is still very, very vulnerable. And, it's likely that future crises will exact a major toll as they have sort of in the past. So that's been my general position. I do think that there's some signs of hope with Macron and with Merkel, even with Schulz if he won. I think he's very mainstream as well, obviously. But it looks like it will be Merkel. But I don't think it's going to be straightforward. I mean, I think it's going to be an incredibly difficult lift for them to do so. But there is some. The recent economic numbers have been generally okay. I think the Trump shock has sort of immobilized, in a way, internationalists in Europe to say, is this really what we want, on Brexit? And it sort of provided a meaning and a cause to people that maybe they were lacking, because it's sort of very clear now, it's one thing to be populist and criticizing the status quo when there aren't that many consequences or when it's not likely it will work. But now, if France had voted for Le Pen, that would have had a major, a hugely global impact. So I think that there is some possibility, but it's still very, very divided. I mean, what I really can't figure out is how Europe would essentially agree on a path forward. I mean, if we look at even just last week in Poland with the president in Poland, the old Europe, new Europe divide is sort of back. Like Eastern European countries are steadfastly opposed to further integration. And then there are massive differences still between the French and German visions. And so I think it will be very, very, very difficult. But I think that there are some people finally who are willing to sort of try. And the challenge is, I think Germany's sort of vision of further integration is so is so restricted and austere in so many ways, and that it makes it hard in terms of getting a sort of consensus in the Eurozone.
Yeah, but that brings me to what we talked earlier about that fascination for populism and nationalism, which you're working on right now in your next research in a number of countries. But you touched on something I think that's very important and often neglected in security discussion, which is the fallout of the 2008 economic crisis, which seems to have disempowered many citizens in many countries, or even accelerated their disempowerment, leading them expressing themselves through electoral process and other processes nowadays. So I wanted to ask you and give your sense of that.
Yeah, I think that on the populist side, I think that the financial crisis is probably the most significant, event since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, it's I think more significant than 9/11 in terms of the international order, because that really was an outside sort of attack that that led to created lots of challenges geopolitically, but it largely united the world against this common threat. The financial crisis, the worst since the 1930s, is something that's ended international orders in the past, and it's something that that I think we thought would be over. Some people thought would be over quite quickly, but we're sort of still living with the consequences of it now. The thing that was fortunate was that the international order in 2008 was actually pretty healthy, right? And when the financial crisis hit in 1929 to 33, it was not healthy. And we sort of had problems that are not as bad as those in the 30s, because I think we went into it in better health, so we had better geopolitical health. But that doesn't mean we haven't had problems. So we've had big problems. The irony is that I think the governments of the world responded to the financial crisis as about as good as they could have in the early phases, maybe not so much later on. But no one really cares about that, because they all, because they don't compare it to how people did in the 30s, right? They compare it to their lives before the crisis, and they look at the downside of sort of saving the system, bailout for banks and other things. And so it generates lots of resentment. And over time, as the growth is sort of lower, and as politics sort of takes its toll, democratic politics takes its toll on the response, you see greater dissatisfaction, and people demanding change, and particularly in Europe, where I think one of the big problems in Europe is that the centre left and the centre right are basically both sort of bound into the same set of constraints, and so they essentially have very, very similar policies. And so when people came to vote at elections, they felt like they had no mechanism to actually have change, because either left or the right were going to have to buy into whatever the agreement was with Germany or in the EU or in the Eurozone, and so there was no choice there. And I think what essentially happened was that was sort of manageable early on, but every election cycle made it weaker, right? Made the centre weaker. And we've now been through several election cycles, and so it's getting weaker every time, right? And sometime you run out of road. Like we ran out of road in Greece a few years ago. That created a crisis that was sort of managed just about. In the US, obviously we had the election last year, but I think the longer this goes on, at some point it's unsustainable. Like it can't continue for 100 years, or it probably can't continue for 50 or even 30. So then the question is, how long will it? And I think the populism risk has not gone away, and it won't really until we have robust levels of growth back, and there's a sense that the crisis is sort of well and truly over.
So I'll ask one more question to Tom, and then I'll open to the audience to leave a good 40 minutes to you all. That's a question I asked you actually at the Chicago Council online, and as the idea of the shining city on the hill is weakening, is the idea of U.S. exceptionalism breaking down?
Yeah, I think America is sort of multifaceted, so I think America for the world is not just Donald Trump, right? It's not just, people don't look at the US and just see Trump. They see him for sure, but they also see all of the other things that the country represents. And I think there are still many people who make the case for sort of American exceptionalism, even within the Trump administration. And I think ultimately, people can distinguish between a government that they may or may not like and the broader sort of behavior of the country over time. And the US, I think, is still playing a crucially important role in the international order. And so, if you were to say to people, do you agree or disagree with Trump, you may get a large number of people internationally saying, well, we don't like Trump. But if you were to say to people, do you want a post-American world, or do you want the US to retreat and just be done with the US, they'd probably give you a very different answer, right? So their answer to Trump is actually more America, more of the traditional America, not less. And I don't think that that's fundamentally going to change, because ultimately I don't really think that there's an alternative to sort of US leadership in the international order if we are to have a continually healthy international order. And so the big choice, though, I think, facing the US will be in, 2 or 3 years' time is, whether or not to sort of double down on this sort of nationalism, whether it's a liberal or a conservative nationalism, and to do less in the world and to pull back, or to try to re-engage and restore that international order to what it was and to restore American leadership. And you mentioned my colleague Bob Kagan before, but he has an interesting insight that he's made on a number of occasions, which is one of the problems about the world order is that the people in the heartlands are actually the last people that will be affected by the decline of that order, right? So if Europe falls apart or Asia falls apart, it will hit everyone else long before it will hit sort of Americans. And actually, the worse the world gets, the stronger the argument for staying out. So he says that in the 30s, the worse it got, then people say, look, we told you it would get bad and now we should do nothing, right? And so it's not that when things decline or deteriorate that there's this sort of impulse to get more involved. So I think it is a big question mark, and I really don't know the answer in terms of how it will come out. But I would say I am, optimistic. I think that a lot of this, some of this is structural, but I think a lot of it is individual, actually. I think the degree of Trump's antipathy toward the order and toward America's role is fairly unique to him. Like, others may want to do less, but they do still believe in that notion of US leadership, both on the left and on the right. And I think that will re-emerge, particularly as it's sort of revealed at the current course that there's not really a plan there and that it's not leading to more positive outcomes.
Thank you, Tom. Well, now I'll open it to the audience, though please keep your questions short, preferably 150 words, Twitter-sized questions will be great, and introduce yourself and your affiliation. Thank you. Yes, sir.
If you could just take a minute and discuss the concept of responsible competition, contrast that with, you read Revisionism's concept from earlier this year of sovereign responsibility. And if there's similarities there with your
So I guess I was a little unclear in terms of what I thought. Richard Haas's book was very interesting, but I wasn't totally clear how sort of the notion of sovereign responsibility sort of differed from what we had, with the responsibility to protect, and with countries sort of having conditional sovereignty or contingent sovereignty over the last few years or so. But I think he did capture something that I do think it's important to, he had some points on that I thought were valid, although I think we've sort of taken them on board, although Trump has cast them aside. The main difference, though, I think, between what he was arguing and what I'm arguing is that I think that the most significant development in world politics is this return of major power competition. And I see that as sort of affecting everything else. I think that's sort of the organizing principle of the strategic era into which we are entering. And so I probably place greater importance on that overall, I think, than he would. I think that that affects the levels of global cooperation that we're going to have on other issues. It affects how we look at the Middle East. It affects the global economy. And I think we need to think very systematically about it, because one thing that we didn't get a chance to mention yet is that, if you think that we've been about how we've been integrating so rapidly economically, and that now we find that that's actually created lots of strategic vulnerabilities, right? And so we're seeing really the weaponization of globalization and interdependence in a way that we haven't seen before. And so what I'm arguing for really in this strategy of responsible competition is that we need to take this notion of 21st century geopolitical competition much more seriously than we have been. We need to think about all facets of that. We need to think about the values component, whether or not it's an ideological competition. We need to think about the revisionist component in terms of how to deter this regional revisionism we spoke about earlier. We need to think about the integration side of it, whether or not it makes sense to continue with unadulterated, really economic integration when that could create strategic vulnerabilities. And I think we need to think about how the Middle East fits into that too. And look at the importance of the Middle East through the prism of that broader strategic competition. And finally, we need to think about what doesn't matter, like to avoid actually getting dragged into a new Cold War where it's a full spectrum competition, and actually identifying the areas that are truly problematic and understanding the difference between those and maybe areas that are not as worrisome, even though we may not necessarily agree with them. And so I think that would probably be how it differs. I think from his, although I'd have to go back and refresh my memory a little bit because I think it was January when I read the book.
Thank you. We'll take another questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, the concept of regional revisionism, do you think that's somewhat naive because applying it to China? Do not China's actions represent a much grander end state in terms of really a global hegemon?
Yeah, I don't think China really is has aspirations of being a global hegemon for a few reasons. I guess one is I think it's normal that countries actually focus regionally. Like maybe at a later point that debate will come, but global hegemons are very, very rare. The Soviets, of course, had global aspirations, but sort of after they sort of inherited a regional dominance from World War II, which was if that hadn't happened, after wars, I think it's different because they present different, sort of a redrawing of the board in a way that we wouldn't have now because we're unlikely to have a major conflict. So I think that on the economic front as well, I think China does have a stake in the international economic order. I don't think they have sort of a fundamentally different vision of it. I think there are problems with Chinese economic behavior for sure, the lack of reciprocity and a sort of mercantilist behavior, but it's generally been fairly supportive of the global economic order.
Just flip back to that. Of all the rising states in the world, if you were to perceive a potential global hegemon, would not China be the most capable to pursue such a goal? And a follow-on question to that would be, if China understands that there are so many nations that are so closely interconnected with the economy, would not China want to leverage that to the extent possible to just ratchet and incrementally increase its sphere of influence as it has represented in the South China Sea and probably going beyond?
Yeah, I just don't see. I mean, I think they may want more global influence, but that's not the same as being a global hegemon. So if you look at the Middle East, for instance, right, the Chinese debate in the Middle East, they do talk about trying to increase Chinese influence in the region, but they talk about it really only in economic terms. Like they basically want to be on good terms with everyone. Right, if you want to be a global hegemon or a hegemon in the Middle East, your strategy can't be to be on good terms with everyone, right? Because at some point you've got to choose. You got to choose whether to contain Iran or support Iran. You got to choose between sort of zero-sum outcomes, and they steadfastly refuse to try to do that, right? So they're willing, maybe to be a diplomatic facilitator for talks here or there, but not to spend any real capital and not to make difficult decisions, and that, I think suggests that they really have very little strategic interest in the long term at the moment, in the Middle East. And that could change, but there's no sign of it yet. Similarly in Europe, the last thing they want to do is sort of to take a real strong view on security issues in Europe, or to be a player there, to back Ukraine against Russia or Russia against Ukraine. They're very careful about that, even at the UN Security Council level. So I think from their point of view, like they just feel that we'll be biting off way more than they could chew. They don't, and they don't really have any aspiration for it. The point I try to make in the book, though, is that even if they're not, that doesn't mean that they're not a problem, right? Because I've sort of found less that people, there are a couple of people who make the argument you're making, I think, that they do have global aspirations. But other people will say the fact that they don't have global aspirations mean that they aren't a challenge. And what I'm doing the book is try to say they actually are a challenge, because how East Asia goes does have global consequences. And so if they emerge as the preeminent power in East Asia and remake regional order there, that has global consequences for the global order, even if they're not a global hegemon. Right. The final point I'd make is the one other additional reason I'm wary of sort of the global hegemon frame, apart from the fact that I don't agree with it, is I think it would lead us to respond to them in all sorts of areas that I think would be counterproductive. So I don't think it's really worth getting worked up over Chinese economic ties in South America. Like, I don't see that as a strategic problem, really. I think, they should knock themselves out. If they want to do that, they can do that, and the US can do the same thing, and Europe can do the same thing, and we'll see where that goes. Similarly, in Africa, there are many problems with Chinese investment in Africa, but they're largely between China and African nations, right, in terms of the future of their countries. They don't, I think, feed into a strategic competition between the US and China. And I think one of the mistakes the US made in the Cold War was to see everything really in terms of the Soviet threat, and obviously there were many mistakes that were made that were partly because things were defined as part of that Cold War that maybe had other origins. And so that's sort of where I think I probably come down in it.
If you allow me, I just want to echo the good question you asked, since we're all about this discussion of trade wars with China and so on. Do you think China will be willing to take a hit financially to inflict pain on the United States?
Yeah, I think it depends over what. I think that they definitely would be on things that they care really deeply about. And I think those things are pretty well known. Taiwan, the regime stability in China, probably Hong Kong, maybe the South China Sea, the sort of things they define as their core interests, maybe a little less than that. There's obviously a dispute about what those core interests are, but I think on those things, they would be willing to, their calculation would be that the US threshold for pain is far lower than theirs, and they may be willing to actually take a hit if they think that a smaller hit to the US would actually cause more, damage here politically. But I think more generally, they're taking some risks on their strategy to create a sphere of influence. But we haven't, as Eli Ratner, Council on Foreign Relations argues, we haven't really tested their appetite for that risk in terms of pushing back, and so we don't know really how far they're willing to push things. And actually, there's some evidence that when there has been strong pushback in the South China Sea, they have pulled back, right? And so I think part of what's going on is a testing of sorts to find out where the U.S. will push back and where it won't.
Okay. Well, the question on the back?
The cost of maintaining the American world order is measured in blood and treasure. And the question is, what are the benefits that we get from this world order? And if there are benefits, how much more should we be prepared to spend to maintain the world order? Or at what point should we say enough is enough, that the benefits outweigh the cost?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because I think one of the critiques of what I'm arguing and what other people are arguing who are sort of internationalists or liberal internationalists is, that we're basically saying if you stop doing this, that the world will sort of fall apart and that it will get really bad, and that cost of re-engaging at a later stage would be much higher, and that the unraveling will be sort of very significant. And to some degree, it's fair to say that what we're arguing is just sort of a hypothetical. Like, we don't really know, right? So we don't really know if the US pulled back from Asia or ended alliances in Asia, whether there would be conflict or not. Like, we could think there might be, but we don't know for sure. And we don't know if Trump actually did pull out of NATO, what Russia might do. And one could say that it would be quite limited, or one could say, as a lot of the academic realists do, that it would be terrible, but actually the US would be quite protected from it, right? That the US could simply pull back, and if there was conflict in Europe or Asia, it's unlikely there would be a regional hegemon, which is a long-standing US concern, and so they could fight it out of sorts. And my point would be, though, that I do think actually that the world we have had over the last 20 years has been actually better than a lot of people think. And for all of the problems, it compares pretty well to periods in the past. There has been geopolitical stability. There has been, economic growth. And I think to actually engage in an experiment, a strategic experiment of unilaterally pulling back from that, with all of the reasons we have to be cautious about what could happen next, I think is a risk too much. And so my view is that, as we saw in the Middle East, when the US did sort of pull back for understandable reasons after Iraq and after the Arab awakening, that the consequences almost collapsed the European Union. And I do think there's reason to believe with Putin that if the US pulled out of Europe, that the instability could spread quite rapidly throughout Eastern Europe, and I think something similar could happen in East Asia. So at the end of the day, these are sort of judgment calls, right? It's not. I don't think there's a hard and fast sort of number on it, but I do think that the real test is, like, what is the one could argue that the interventions in the Middle East have been costly, but what has the cost been of upholding NATO? Right? What has the cost been of upholding the alliances in Asia? And I think it's pretty, on balance, it really justifies the benefit. The cost of NATO is maybe in defense spending, but the NATO countries have been at peace with Russia, in a high state of tension sometimes for quite some time. So it sort of worked, and similarly in East Asia. So I think there's a really high bar for actually dismantling the regional order in those two parts of the world.
We have time for two more questions. Sir in the back.
I have read your article about G20. How do you evaluate the results of G20 overall in the context of American national interests?
I'm struggling to write a follow-up article to that in terms of how to make sense of it. So you'll get sort of my thoughts in draft form. I think that the G20, this meeting of the G20, some people describe it as a G19 plus one because the US is isolated. But to me, the big story, which sort of ties into the book, is that there is no G19. Like the US is not an anomaly here, right? The G20 was sort of founded on the idea of convergence, that everyone was sort of going toward the same type of international order. And that's actually not true. And it wasn't true at the time of the US election, and it's definitely not true today. And Trump's election has sort of accelerated those trends. And so we see this contestation sort of for the future of the world order, and we see the G20 itself becoming much more contested. So they're not, the G20 meetings used to be incredibly boring, but now they're arguing about protectionism. There are side meetings between Putin and Trump where people worry if he'll agree to a sphere of influence or a partnership with Russia. There are all sorts of big things beginning to happen that haven't happened before. And I think what this summit shows is that sort of contestation is well and truly underway. Now, on the specifics, I thought the meeting with Putin went very badly. I think that Tillerson and Trump were duped in a way, that they didn't have a lot of experience going in, and it showed. It was an old Russian trick to sort of offer a committee or a task force of investigation into something. And the fact that Trump raised the issue of hacking shows he was aware that he had to do something, but that he didn't promise any consequences, I think, undid all of that. So I think that they hoped, and I think the fact that they wouldn't let the president do a press conference probably reflected that they were really worried about what he might say, and so their strategy was to try to restrict the flow of information. And so if there was no information about the meeting, then people wouldn't know if it went good or badly, and so they try to strictly limit that. And as we saw with the tweets this morning, the minute he did begin, and yesterday, the minute he did begin to speak, actually the whole thing began to unravel in terms of what he said about what he had agreed to and not. So I thought that part of it was bad. I thought the trade and the economic part was okay, in that they did agree communicate language. The protectionist threat has been averted for the moment. I mean, the steel tariffs could come in next week, so that could be undone in a few days' time. But in general, that part of it was a little bit more stable. The climate stuff, I think, was pretty much as we expected. I don't think that was any surprise in particular. So I think that's sort of, that probably would be my sort of overall readout on it.
To follow up on that question briefly, reminds me of what Trump announced with Cyber Alliance, and then with Russia, and then coming back to his word. And since we're all about the discussion on global order, I wanted to ask you: can there be a vision in the technology internet age, a global order of technology?
Yeah, I mean, the problem isn't the technology. The problem is the intentions, right? Like, the problem is that it's not cyber as some, technological innovation. It's the fact that countries are engaged in a rivalry with each other, and they see cyber as a tool to advance their interests in that competition. And that's why Trump's idea obviously was so flawed, was because, this is not a misunderstanding. Right, this is not some misunderstanding between Russia and the United States. This is a clash of interests. Right now, from the Russian point of view, they'll say they're responding to a political war that the U.S. started, and from the U.S. point of view, it looks very different, right? But they're not. The idea that a task force or a unit on cybersecurity would achieve anything, I think, was very clearly. Everyone knew the minute they announced that would never fly. But I think it does. To me, the question is less about global cooperation on these things, which is, can we come to some sort of strategic equilibrium on it, where, through various interactions and imposition of costs, we basically understand that certain types of behavior are acceptable and certain types of behavior aren't. That doesn't come, I think, in the abstract from sitting down, negotiating shared experiences, and the realization that certain types of action will be counterproductive. And so if Russia had paid a cost for that, maybe it would prevent them from doing it in the future. And maybe, if, because of the election last year, the next time there's a protest in Moscow, I mean, that may, affect U.S. calculations too, in terms of what the Russian response might be. And over time, we might figure out what is actually worthwhile and what isn't. I think that's and that's what happened with nuclear weapons in a very different way. There was not mutually assured destruction from the beginning. It took a while to take effect. This will be very different, but those interactions may lead to some sort of equilibrium over time.
We have time for one more question, sir.
So this was a small part of your talk, but I was curious about a comment you made describing the explanation of NATO enlargement and Russian aggression as a red herring. I was wondering if you could expound on that. From my understanding, NATO enlargement is the movement of heavy weapons capabilities in the Baltics and other provocations upon behalf of, in exchange for the West and Russia. Explain in large part the status quo relations between the two countries. 2010-2014 Russian Defense White Paper cited NATO enlargement as a violation of their vital interests. They fought 2 wars in 10 years in 2 countries that were candidates for accession to Western security infrastructure. They've absorbed significant economic punishments, so analysis said that Putin was issued 20 to get sanctions relief from that.
Yeah, so I do think that NATO and the EU were seen by Putin as a threat, but I don't think it was because of the troops, right? Like, I think that it was because of the political threat, particularly from color revolutions. And, it's notable that the Ukraine crisis, started over an association agreement with the EU, not with NATO. And I think the NATO expansion has been, everyone I think really understands, has been off the table for those former Soviet countries since Georgia in 2008, right? There's really been no prospect of that. The idea that Obama was going to expand NATO to include Georgia or Ukraine, I think, was just totally impossible, right? I mean, anyone who followed it at all, I think, knows that he would not have done that, and the Germans were opposed to it. And I think I do know, I mean, you're right, the Russians have complained about it for a long time, but I'm arguing that objectively they did not face a severe military threat from NATO, but I do think that they understood, and I get the point about perceptions, but I do think that they perceived a much greater threat actually politically, that they did believe, with some justification from their point of view, that that the spreading of democracy to their neighbors could result in, the power of example with color revolution in Moscow down the road, and that if Ukraine had become democratic and market oriented and associated with the EU, even with no troops from the West, that would have posed a threat to Russia, because it would be out of their control and it would be sort of a force for political liberalization and modernization. And I think if you look at how Putin's conceived of political warfare from 2012 when he came back and he initiated that review where they saw sort of color revolutions as a new type of warfare, that it very much fits in with his hostility to the EU in particular. I actually think he has more of a problem with the EU probably than he does with NATO, because he sort of views the EU in a way as more pervasive and ultimately more threatening than NATO, because I think he does get that NATO is not going to wage an offensive war against Russia. Now, I take the point that he's made the anti-NATO remarks many times, but I think the underlying cause is that fear he has of his regime, of the regime's survival. The question, and I'll just finish on this, the question that arises then is, do we say essentially that because he worries about a threat from his own people getting inspiration from elsewhere, does that then give him a veto over democracy in other countries? Does that give him a right to interfere in democracy in his neighbors to prevent that from taking hold? And my view is that it doesn't, right? I don't think that NATO should be expanded to include Ukraine. I don't think it should be fully taken off the table, because I don't think that any country should have a veto, but I don't think it's on the cards. I don't think anyone really thinks it's on the cards. But I do think that the people of Ukraine have the right to be democratic if they want to be, right, and to be free of political interference. And I think that has a cost, and managing that cost, I think, is a problem, it's a challenge.
Well, Tom, as much as I would love to continue, it's been a pleasure. Thank you to you all for contributing.